webinar. And then at 3:30 Eastern, so right after this hour-and-a-half content-based webinar, we do an open Q&A. And we also have an open Q&A on Thursday evenings at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. And so essentially what happened is we come in and during those Q&A sessions, you can dump your questions into the chat. And I try to get through as many live questions as possible. You'll see that in the 3:30 p.m. slot. And then generally for the content-based webinars, we sometimes have like 10 or 15 minutes extra at the end where we can ask extra questions. But generally, they're mostly like presentation-based. And then the Q&As are really when we do a deep dive into all the live questions, any personal questions you have, any shares, anything like that. And we have a really amazing community here of like-minded people, very supportive people. So really, really grateful for everybody and excited to see some new faces this afternoon. So what we're basically going to start by doing is doing a deep dive into codependency itself. And for those of you who are not super familiar, codependency and enmeshment sort of go hand in hand. And we're going to talk about both of those things at a root level. So I'm just going to dive right in. And my hope is that by diving right in now, we'll have some time for at least 1 or 2 live questions at the end, because I find that codependency is such a wide-ranging topic, and so many individuals actually struggle with codependency more than they probably realize, especially of insecure attachment. And so by doing a deep dive into this, hopefully you can recognize, and my goal for you today would be to recognize what specific patterns you resonate with, where you're like, oh, that's me. I definitely have that codependent pattern or behavior. And by getting to the bottom of those things, you'll be able to really hone in on exactly what work to do using the steps we're going to outline. So first and foremost, the definition of codependency, basically our dictionary definition of codependency, is excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner following excessive behavioral support. So we tend to have this sort of like 2-part element of codependency, which is where we have a lot of reliance, and it can be being reliant on somebody who needs a lot of support or being the person who needs a lot of support in the dynamic. But the way I like to think of codependency is basically a pattern of relationship behaviors that almost create a form of addiction between 2 people because of specific subconscious fears and beliefs that each person has, both about themselves and the other person. And so those fears really blur the lines between self-identity and personal boundaries, which then creates these unhealthy power exchanges and imbalances within a relationship dynamic, where it's not like you have 2 people showing up as their whole self. And there's a lot of stuff that comes out of this. We have a lot of covert contracts that come out of this, right? I'm going to do all these nice things for you, and then you're going to owe me, and then you'll do those nice things that I want, but we're not actually expressing our needs. Or sometimes we can see these different dynamics where we expect things from others because we're giving so much. And so when they let down our expectation, it's very painful. But basically, we have this behavior where we may find temporary relief from that codependent dynamic, but then there are these very long-term consequences. And what I found over the years with so many people in my client-based practice in the past was that people didn't necessarily realize the extent of, number one, just how codependent they might have been without really consciously recognizing. And number 2, just how harmful codependency actually is to the overall well-being of a relationship. So we're going to really dive into all of this because by unpacking these things, you're actually empowered to heal and change some of these different dynamics. So another big question is, as we go into the codependency content for today, a lot of people will ask me, well, like, what's the difference between codependency and enmeshment? And enmeshment is basically a description of a relationship between 2 or more people, but can also be in a whole family dynamic where personal and emotional boundaries are permeable and unclear. So essentially what happens is, like, maybe you have 2 people at an emotional level who feel each other's emotions and who are really picking up on each other's emotional state, and then taking personal responsibility for that to a certain degree. But the main difference between codependency and enmeshment is codependency has permeable boundaries across all facets, right? We can have physical boundaries, We can have sexual boundaries that are permeable. We can have emotional boundaries. We can have thought boundaries, like our opinions, our ideas, our beliefs. I can't have a different belief than one of my parents, or my child can't have a different belief than I do, politically or religiously. So there's this dynamic about our thought boundaries, but also can be our material and financial boundaries. So codependency can be permeable all boundaries, but is really characterized by then how we behave or act in relationship to those boundaries. Enmeshment is like we're just taking on other people's emotions, right? We're just feeling other people's emotions. Some people may cope with that by pulling away from people, not really liking to take on other people's emotions. Where in codependent dynamics, somebody's going to take personal responsibility for somebody else's state or behavior. Okay, so those are some of the big differences there. And obviously, enmeshment and codependency are more likely to go hand in hand, because if you have an enmeshed family dynamic where everybody's picking up on each other's emotions and mood, it's much easier to personalize it and to make yourself personally responsible for it. But something that I noticed that's really important to pay attention to is when we are codependent with poor emotional boundaries, we often have all of these beliefs that are highly dysfunctional for our lives. So we may get into our lives and think, oh, because I noticed what this person's feeling, I'm responsible for fixing them. Or, oh, if this person I love is going through a hard time, I should save them. Or we can so easily make decisions in our lives and relationships that are motivated more by the fear of feeling guilty than by what our actual truth is. And this is one of the biggest facets that I find comes out of it. So maybe you decide, I'm going to quit my job and move home with my family because they need some support. But maybe you were doing that from a fear of feeling guilty rather than your actual truth. And maybe instead, if you were, coming into the ability to take yourself into consideration, you would have done lots to support your family, but maybe not in a sacrificial way, right? Maybe not at the expense of yourself as an individual and in relationship to your own personal needs. So when we really look at moving out of this, codependency also, breaking down codependency involves the art of learning to consider ourselves again, being able to take ourselves into consideration, our own needs into consideration, and do what we can for others and contribute as much as we can, but without it actually being an accidental or indirect assault on the relationship to ourselves in the process. So there are two types of being raised in an enmeshed dynamic. And obviously where we're raised has a huge impact on our subconscious programming and is likely to be where we bring these things out into the world from. And there's direct enmeshment and indirect enmeshment. So direct enmeshment can be because of things like enmeshed values. So, family always saves family, right? That can be some of the messaging you get. And it can be like, oh, we always bail each other out or do whatever we need in some kind of situation. But sometimes one of the downsides of that is like, there can be so much enabling happening. And I think sometimes we don't realize how big of an impact enabling has on other people in terms of actually stunting their growth. So it can sometimes be, oh, if this person keeps repeating the same mistakes, I'm always there to fix and save them, but you're not giving that person room to have to learn and go through the learnings and experience of their own accord. And so that can be a huge reason that codependency and enmeshment come up. Another big thing can be if you grew up in a parentified home. Obviously we did like a whole course about just parentification, but if you grew up in a home where, parents were often unloading on you or oversharing their emotions or their feelings or putting you in the middle of different dynamics and situations, then obviously you're likely to take a lot of that on, because at a very young age, you can grow up in a household feeling like, hey, like, I'm so scared about them having problems because what's going to happen to my family. And there can be that very innate fear at a very young age that then conditions a lot of how you're going to adapt and relate to others in your adult life. And parents or caregivers, if they're constantly taking their child's boundaries away or overriding the boundaries, like a child cries and it's like, stop crying. Or, a child has a different opinion than their family, and that opinion is given a hard time, right? Or shamed in some way. Or physical boundaries, your physical space, right? You're not allowed to close your door in your room, or We have to be holding hands when we go out into the world as a family, as a little child. Like if there's no physical space boundaries, if any of these things are assaulted over time, then our boundaries become permeable. We are essentially getting conditioned to think, feel, and believe that our boundaries actually don't matter. And in fact, it can go a step further, which can be you actually may come to associate that your own boundaries are unsafe, are going to get you punished, are going to get you rejected, are going to get you abandoned, are going to get you shamed. And so we may learn, okay, well, I have to give up my boundaries in order to adapt into my family environment and to feel safe and to feel accepted. So you can see how some of these roots come alive, right? Where we get these codependent patterns because of these different dynamics that may take place. And those are more of our direct version. Then we have our indirect codependency and enmeshment that can take place. And this comes a lot from when a child really senses their own parents' pain or suffering. So if they, I've had a lot of conversations over the years with clients who felt that one of their parents was really depressed and constantly saw that and constantly worried, like, is my mom going to be okay? Because if she's not, like, what's going to happen to me? Are we going to get split up? What's going to happen? And so this child, to adapt, becomes the caretaker of that parent. And that can happen because of depression. That can be that happen because of a parent being a single parent and the child seeing all the stress that parent is under. That can be because that child sees their parent maybe struggling with addiction, or volatile relationships, or that parent being in some sort of dynamic where their emotions are very obvious. It's consistent over time, and the child feels a sense of fear and helplessness, and then tries to adapt to becoming that caretaker role as a strategy to relieve their own pain. And so all of these different things may unfold, and all of these things can create direct, indirect, or both forms of codependency and relating to other people. So try to take a look for a moment and see, like, do you see any of these roots in your family household? And there can be other forms, but these are obviously some of the most common ones. And if you feel comfortable, I always love when you guys share in the chats. So if you feel comfortable and feel comfortable sharing a little bit about like what some of your roots were, if you struggle with codependency and where this came up for you. And did you have some indirect codependency roots that took place, or indirect? And okay, beautiful share. So Abby says, hi, Abby, how are you? Indirect codependency, and enmeshment. Beautiful. Gemini says, I had my money taken away by my parents, had to report everywhere I went, and they would call people's house phones to confirm where I said I would be. Fantastic. So you see a lot of that kind of like control facet, right? And there's an element of like, hey, a parent being able to look out for their child, but when there's no discussion, there's no negotiation of needs, there's no communication about boundaries, there's no room for any of that. That's indirectly teaching you that, hey, you're not allowed to have any boundaries at all, right? And you can see how we then bring these out into our world and our adult lives. My mom would share her marital problems and issues about my dad. Fantastic, right? That's a really common one. And it gets confusing for children a lot of the time, right? Because there can be this dynamic of like, that's too much to take on at a young age. And then you feel put in the middle, or sad for both parents, or confused or afraid. My sister and I are both on this call. We're having a private chat about what it was like for us growing up. So good. I'm glad you're both here together. That's so sweet. And sometimes it can put these sort of light bulbs on of like, oh, we had a lot of these different patterns in different ways. Extreme codependency and enmeshment, hi Chelsea, which led to a narcissistic marriage. Wow. And here's something else that happens, right? So Chelsea's sort of hitting the nail on the head here, which is when you learn in childhood that your boundaries are not okay, we are attracted in our adult lives to what represents our subconscious comfort zone. We're attracted to what our associations of love are. So we look for what's familiar. So if you learn, okay, boundarylessness is love, then you grow up and guess what happens? Well, I go into boundaryless relationships. And on the flip side of that, generally narcissistic people are looking for boundaryless people to attach to, because it means that they can garner a whole bunch of narcissistic support apply. So we can see how these different pathways and patterns are likely to play out. Having my doors taken off and diaries read as a teenager. Yeah, that's a really tough one, Kenzie, because you can see what an emotional violation is. And as a teenager, there's this behavioral stage of development where you're individuating as a young adult, and you're sort of learning what your own personal needs are and your own, personality is supposed to become. And so it can be a very sensitive and fragile time. And then to have your diaries read and these sorts of things, you can see how that would feel like a huge emotional boundary violation. Indirect, Pernille says, single unhappy mom. Yeah, so you can see how you take that on, right? And worry about mom. And really what's happening, right, is when you're a child, your subconscious mind is really just, at the end of the day, at its root level, just prioritizing surviving. So if you see a parent and I'm completely dependent on this parent to survive, like I can't go out and get a job and pay the bills and put a roof over my head at 5 or 6 years old, there's a dependency there. And you see that parent not okay, children will do almost anything to make their parents okay in whatever form they can, because it's actually survival based for that individual at a deeper subconscious level. So it's like, if my parent's not okay, I'm going to not survive anyways, right? There's that subconscious sort of assumption. And if I can somehow make my parent okay or do whatever I can, then we'll both be okay. They'll be okay. And then I'll be okay accordingly. So you can see how this programming these adaptations would happen. And the programming would sort of like get rooted here because of what's going on at a much deeper level. Okay, I'll read 2 more. After my father's divorce, I became the wife in roles, cooking, cleaning, etc. at 8 years old. Yeah. And that's a big part of parentification, right? So you see that parentified role that can come up, and it's so common. It can be so challenging. Neglect can be enmeshment, having less needs to make the parent's life easier. Absolutely. Very beautifully said, right? Neglect can become this indirect form of enmeshment because guess what happens? Neglect parentifies children indirectly, right? You have to grow up, fend for yourself, take care of your own needs in all these different ways before there's a time where that's supposed to naturally be happening. So really amazing shares. So hopefully you can sort of recognize some of your own patterns in these different dynamics so far. So we have the direct and the indirect enmeshment. And these are some of the things that what happen. These are some of the adaptations that take place as a byproduct of those behaviors. Okay. So we have these ways of coping because of what we're exposed to. And then some of the costs of this essentially long-term can be, number one, a weaker sense of self-identity. And this identity is often others oriented. It's derived from the outside in. So you may find, for example, that you're more focused on what people think of you, or what other people's opinions are of you, or how your relationships are going, or how often you spend time with friends, or whether you're in a romantic partnership or not. And you may have that element of your life so much making up a part of your identity that there isn't room for you to really consider, who am I? What are my deep needs as a person? What would I like my life to be about in this season or this chapter or long term? What is the mission and vision for what I want to create while I'm here? What is important to me in relationships? What are my non-negotiables? What are my boundaries? What do I need to feel fulfilled? And in many of the other areas of life, career, financial, mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, these other 6 of the 7 areas outside of relationships, there can be this sort of neglect that essentially takes place to that relationship to self. And what happens as a byproduct of this is that the effect relationships have on us as individuals is magnified. So when you have your identity made up of other people and just your relationships, and there's not much of a self-identity you've developed outside of that, then when something wrong happens in a relationship, somebody doesn't call you back, or somebody's not texting enough, or somebody's upset with you, it feels like your world is collapsing, right? Because so much of who you are and who you identify yourself to be is from outside in space. Feels like there's this extra element of fragility taking place. Poor boundaries. And generally I see with really codependent individuals, it's not even just poor boundaries. It's almost like a bit of a dissociation from self. It's not even really aware of what your feelings and needs are in real time. And, I've had many conversations with many of you guys in here over the years who have said, like, before I came into PDS, I didn't even know what needs were. I didn't even know that I had needs as a person, let alone how to meet them or how to show up for them. And so, we can imagine some of the costs of that, right? But also some of the beauty in learning those elements of ourselves. And then when we know who we are and what our needs are, and we're in relationship to that, we also know how to communicate those things to other people, which then leads to those needs being more met and us feeling more seen and heard and connected in our actual truth. Another huge common thread with codependency is people pleasing. And people pleasing can create a lot of low self-esteem long-term, can create a lot of resentment in relationships, can be very painful. It can make us feel really unseen and unheard. People pleasers generally feel like they don't matter to others because they're not sharing their truth. So their truth isn't getting across to other people. People don't know what their truth is. And so how can they possibly make that feel like it matters? Sometimes there can be reactivity with codependency, because we can really hold in our truth for so long and then become really frustrated. Codependency often has a big need for control. There can be a lot of control power dynamics in codependent relationships, unfortunately, where it's like, okay, well, if you're not okay, then I don't feel okay. So I have to control you, and how you're feeling and how you're doing is a subconscious strategy to not feel bad myself. Right? So it's like, I have to control how you feel so that I don't feel badly about how you feel. And you can see, like, if there's enmeshment there, of course that's going to take place. And we can also see different dynamics like denial in relationships, poor communication, sometimes intimacy issues long-term. And sometimes I've seen things like people taking on other people's emotions and then feeling frustrated at them for not feeling okay, angry that other people are in pain because you're personalizing that pain so deeply. And generally, there can be blame dynamics as well from codependency, because there's so many blurred lines in relationships. So some symptoms, codependency can create feelings of, and I know it's like doomsday right now, all the bad parts of codependency, but we're going to talk about what to do and how to break through all these things. But I always find the more specific we can find, like what's going on for us and what it looks like and what it feels like, the more we catch it in real time throughout our lives, the easier it is to catch as things are unfolding, and the easier it becomes to change as a result. So codependency can feel like feelings of stress, overwhelm. Some of the feeling symptoms usually associated with codependency are feelings of pressure, shame, anxiety, sadness, and generally elevated levels of jealousy, anger, and hurt by other people. It can produce low self-esteem and huge fears of being rejected or abandoned, because if I think who I am is about only my relationships in my life externally, and that's my identity, then if those relationships get pulled away or broken away in some form, it feels like my identity is gone. It feels like death to self, right? It feels like death to the ego mind, to the personality. And so this is part of why you'll see people who are more codependent have such a significantly more challenging time going through a breakup, right? It's like, it's so painful. There can be a really intense fear for codependent people around making mistakes in relationships, being a failure. And we can have counter dependency at times where people are enmeshed and then don't like that enmeshed feeling, and so try to actually stay away from too much closeness or aloneness. And we can see these like codependent, counter dependent dynamics at times. So one of the first things that's really important to be able to move through if we're trying to actually break out of codependency is recognizing the beliefs that got us there. So if we're looking at sort of some of the threads, we're going to talk about the main steps to healing codependency in a little bit. But if you look at some of the threads, right? Thread number one is I am codependent because I have beliefs that keep me there, right? So I believe things like I am responsible for how other people feel. I believe that, other people's problems are mine to solve and repair, and vice versa, right? I believe that I need everybody's love and approval in order to stay safe, right? So we take on these codependent beliefs. We're going to talk about those. I also am out of relationship to the ability to meet my own needs and to know what they are. Okay. So as long as I don't know my needs, then I'm going to go outside in my outside world on autopilot and try to get them met indirectly. Instead of knowing my needs, being able to meet them myself, and also being able to communicate them eloquently and specifically so that others can meet them in a healthy, interdependent way as well. And then we also have the boundarylessness elements, right? We don't feel safe or comfortable setting boundaries. So there's these different threads that sort of lead into this, and this is what we're going to really unpack. So part number one, beliefs and fears associated with codependency. These are not the only ones. These are some very common ones. So number one, I am bad. If hurt someone's feelings that I love, okay, I'm a bad person. And I'm also unlikely to get my needs met if I ever make a mistake in a relationship and I sort of feel unworthy of love. So I am bad if I make a mistake. Like I'm a bad person, not, oh, I made a mistake and that's human and I should go correct it and be accountable, but I am a bad person, right? And you can see how that I am bad core wound will sponsor this fear of guilt, this fear of feeling guilty. So I have to keep making decisions to avoid that guilt feeling. Okay. Number two. And so what I would love as I go through, I'm going to go through 8 really common ones. But then share in the chat other ones that you notice or find, and we'll go back through them together in a little bit. Number two, I am responsible for how other people feel. Byproduct of being conditioned in an enmeshed home or some sort of enmeshed relationship in your upbringing. Number 3, I have to be perfect in order to gain love or earn my worth from other people and relationships. Number 4, other people's problems are mine to solve and repair. And if I don't, they get internalized as being my fault, right? And try to notice if that shows up for you anywhere. Like, oh my gosh, if this person's in pain and I know it and I'm not fixing it, it's my fault. Like I have to take that element of responsibility again, right? Number 5, I won't survive without approval from others. Okay. Going back to, and you can see the roots of these things, right? Like these conditioned patterns that we grow up with. Well, what are the conditioned patterns? If as a child, you felt like you needed that approval from your caregivers to stay safe and survive, and then you morphed yourself into whatever was needed for their approval, there's this idea that if I don't get approval, it's like death to self. And that's where we can experience some of that panic and fear and anxiety, even though as an adult, our circumstances are different. When the programming takes place, those are still your programs all this time later, unless they're actively honed in on and actually reconditioned. Number 6, guilting and shaming myself will keep me good and thus safe. Okay, really common one. Number 7, my sense of self is derived from my external relationships. We kind of touched on that earlier. And number 8, a lot of core wounds. So it's not just number 8, but there's a few core wounds in here. I will be abandoned. I will be alone. If I'm alone, I will be unsafe. I am unworthy. I can easily be unloved. And I am not enough. Okay, so we'll see all these different drivers can lead us into, well, if I think I'm not enough, I have to constantly prove to you that I am. And that can often lead to people pleasing. If I feel like I'm unworthy, I constantly have to earn my worth in relationships by providing and doing something in order to receive love. If I'm afraid of being abandoned, I may people please. So try to notice the different codependent beliefs that show up for you and what really shows up most strongly. Okay, let's see here. I wish there was a slide for this. I have a slide for this. It's not shareable because it's on PowerPoint, but I can, the notes are actually in the codependency course. There's actually a workbook that has these listed out at the back of the codependency course. Brianna says, guess I had everything on the menu. A lot of those codependent beliefs. Accountable of myself and my voice, but completely responsible for others' happiness. Wow, exhausting. Yeah. And it's so tiring to be in that position. And generally when there's a lot of codependency, the idea of letting go of that can be almost scary. It's like, wait, what if I'm not taking responsibility for people's happiness? And we can become like afraid or feel guilt immediately. Number 7, beautiful, Pero. Number 8 was the different core beliefs that can come. So I will be alone. I will be abandoned. I will be unsafe. I have to earn my worth. I'm not good enough. All these different dynamics. Guilting and shaming myself keeps me good, right? That's such a common one. And it's so incorrect, right? Like we have this so deeply ingrained because this is the system we all grew up in to a certain degree. We all grew up in like classical conditioning. So you get punished for wrong, rewarded for right. So we take that entire system and we install it in the relationship to ourselves. Oh, I have to punish myself when I'm bad. And that's what keeps me good. And it's like, no, that was actually just a dysfunctional system of conditioning. Though there may be parts that serve from a socialization perspective, but the vast majority of it, there's a lot of dysfunction and trauma indirectly. And it essentially teaches you that love is conditional from your caregivers, which doesn't really do a whole lot of good either. And then, we use that system and become ingrained about our operating way in the world. So very useful to free ourselves from. Alone equals unsafe is my biggest core wound. Excellent. Very well said. And that's generally like our big anxious preoccupied dynamic. I am unsafe, all those beliefs I can relate with. I will be abandoned, near constant effort not to be. Yeah, that's so well said. And like, try to take a moment before we move on to the next parts here and try to notice like, things like this, near constant effort not to be abandoned. What does that actually cost you as a person? Like, what does that cost you to your sense of self? What does that cost you to your ability to just like rest, to your ability to receive from people in relationships, to your ability to be vulnerable to people and share your truth? To your ability to set boundaries and to feel safe doing so. Like, it's exhausting. So try to notice these different dynamics. Because of my disability, I have to put up with more disrespect because I need more support. Ouch. That would be really hard to think that I have to put up with more disrespect because I need more support. Right. And I would say, like, especially you, Abby, because you're always in here, like, learning and growing and sharing, like, I would be like, how can I assert myself in healthy ways so I can feel like I'm getting more respect from people around me? And obviously there's times where people are disrespectful people. And maybe those are good times to try to extend your boundaries out if possible in your situation. But definitely don't believe that you have to put up with more disrespect, right? Because that will take place in all of our relationships and we'll bring that forward. Great share. Yes, unworthy, have to earn others' acceptance, approval, and desperate for love, all of the above. Yeah. So great shares, you guys. So I won't survive without approval from others. Yeah. So you can see like all of the fear that comes around this, right? All of the fear that comes from having to feel like this, live like this, experience this regularly. And that also means there's all this freedom on the other side. So we'll talk about what to actually do, but we're just sort of going through all the roots here. But what we do need to do at a high level, and I'm going to break this into steps, is we need to learn to get back in touch with our individual feelings, needs, and opinions. I would often say to clients who were very codependent when they would make a decision about their life, like to go back to school and change careers or to take a job or not take a job, they would be so like very codependent people would go right into like, well, how this is going to affect my husband or my wife, or how this is going to affect what my parents think, or how, and while it's important to consider those things, that has to be something you consider in conjunction with your own truth. And if you don't really know how to navigate and get in touch with your truth, here's what ends up happening in codependent relationships. Bob thinks, oh my gosh, my wife, I have to stay, an hour later at work. My wife wouldn't be okay with me taking this job. And although I love this job so much and I really want to take this job, I can't upset my wife, so I can't do it. And so then Bob doesn't take the job. And then Bob feels unhappy at work, frustrated, oftentimes secretly resentful towards his wife for him not taking the job, even though it was his choice. And then brings that home into the family dynamic. And there's generally more costs long-term to not being able to consider yourself when making decisions than there could ever be from making a decision that has an effect on somebody else, but then you negotiate how to mitigate some of those side effects of a choice. It's in alignment with your truth. So it's so important to value individual feelings, needs, and opinions, to get in touch with what those are. And to make sure as well that you're not in a position like to really hone in and kind of do an audit about how much you try to control other people's feelings and emotions, right? With a lot of codependency, like whenever we feel afraid, we try to control. And so, or it's a very common mechanism that we try to use. And so try to look at, like, if I have a lot of codependency, how much am I trying to actually control other people, even if it's in this like sort of harmless way, or the intention is harmless? There may still be a lot of elements, and that's exhausting, right? Trying to control people's perception of you, trying to control how much people like you, trying to control people's feelings so that it doesn't upset you, trying to control other people's behaviors or how they should be, which can be really exhausting. And so just try to notice, like taking inventory there, how much does that come up for you from 1 to 10? And a lot of codependent individuals really lose where they are emotionally, right? The ability to like feel their emotions in real time. And boundaries is a huge part of this. Strengthening your self-identity is a huge part of this. And one other thing I want to say before we really go into like some of these 7 steps to recondition codependency is that, you know, a lot of people who are self-proclaimed empaths, right? And I believe in empath. I believe in all of that stuff. There's actually a really great TED talk about highly sensitive people. I think those things go hand in hand, and there's actually like a genetic variation found about it, all this stuff. So I support this, but a lot of times what I notice happens is people who are very empathic or empathetic will get into relationship dynamics where they give of themselves so much that eventually they have nothing left to give. And they're almost like forced to swing to the other side of the continuum and become more selfish and narcissistic. And not that they are a narcissist by any means, but more narcissistic because they burnt themselves out to the point of desperation. They have to take from other people. They have to, emotionally only receive and not have two-way relationships. So sometimes being in this space can actually lead you to burnout, where exactly what you fear ends up having to take place as a result, just to be able to sort of adapt and survive. So we'll do 2 other things, and then we'll go through some of the steps. We're going to go through questions to gauge codependency. So we're going to go through a codependency score. And I'm going to go through these really slowly, but you can score yourself from 1 to 13. Okay. And then you can divide one by the other, obviously, and come up with like a codependency percentage. I know that people love doing these. I love doing these too. So get ready. Okay. So, codependency question number 1, do you say yes to others frequently when you actually want to say no? And think about this as like, you may realize after the fact too. You may say yes in real time and then later realize it was a no, but you still said yes to others. And that's because you're disconnected from your own self in real time when around others. Okay. You can give yourself a 1 out of 1. You can give yourself a 0.5. But that's question number 1. Number 2, do you find yourself being triggered when other people set a boundary with you? Okay, if this triggers you, it's probably because you're boundaryless with other people. So then when somebody sets a boundary with you, you're like, what is this? This is unjust. It's unfair because I don't set boundaries with you. Why would you set them with me? Okay, so number 2, do you find yourself being triggered with other people setting a boundary with you? Number 3, do you get extremely upset or bothered and find yourself unable to focus when other people are upset by something you did? Okay, so if somebody's upset with you, do you feel like it literally destabilizes your life? Or are you able to say, hey, we're going through like a situation right now, and I trust that we'll resolve this when we have some time, right? Like maybe you're at work and you can't leave work, but you can finish your work day and you can have a call on your way home, or, so do you find yourself unable to focus? It's completely disrupting. Okay. Number 4, do you crave approval or praise in order to feel good about yourself? In other words, are you deriving your sense of self-esteem mostly exclusively from the outside in? Our next one, do you lose yourself in relationships or become afraid of being swallowed whole by relationships? Do you feel afraid that like once I'm in a relationship, my sense of self goes out the window? Like there's no existence of this any longer. It fades away. Okay. And maybe you still prioritize connecting with people despite that, but try to notice like how much that one shows up for you. I'll say it one more time. Do you lose yourself in relationships or get afraid of being swallowed whole? Our next one, do you suppress your emotions or pretend you're okay when you're not? Okay. So do you actually feel comfortable sharing with people like, hey, I had a bad day. Hey, I'm going through a hard time. Hey, I need support. Or do you think, oh, no, I can't share that because I might be rejected or abandoned, or somebody might judge me in some kind of negative way. And so you hide that part of yourself in some form, right? To get approval, to not rock the boat, to not have conflict. Our next one is, do you avoid speaking up or sharing your truth or your needs because you're trying to avoid conflict? right? So they kind of go hand in hand. Are you like, oh, I'm not going to say my side because I don't want there to be a problem? Our next one, do you put excessive pressure on yourself in relationships and feel like a mistake could lead to the failure or end of a relationship immediately? Okay. And I'm not talking about like, hey, if you are in a monogamous commitment in a marriage and you decide that you're going to cheat with somebody, that may not have consequences. I'm not talking about those like clearly agreed upon things. I'm talking about you magnify all the little things in relationships. Like if I say the wrong thing, I hurt someone's feelings. Oh my gosh, that would be the end. I could get abandoned. Okay. Do you blame other people at times to hide your mistakes because you're afraid of the consequences of taking accountability? Okay. And this is, you have to sort of be really aware for this one and really sit with it for a moment sometimes. But has there ever been a time where rather than just owning something and being like, oh, I did mess up. Oh, that was a mistake. I didn't even realize it. I'm sorry. Rather than doing that, that's too scary, right? Oh my gosh, if I do that, I'm going to be a bad person. The person might not want to be with me. I'm not worthy of them anymore. I'm not good enough for them. So this background thing is there that drives you to like deflect all the time, like afraid to really be accountable and take ownership. Our next one, do you excessively compare yourself to others? One of the really interesting things about this one is I find that when people are excessively comparing themselves to others, it's because they're trying to figure out who they are and where they sit in the world. It's like they don't have this like awareness of like just who I am. And so I derive my self identity by like you versus me, because I don't know just who I am on my own, what my own individual feelings and needs are. And what you'll find more and more is that the less you're doing that, the more you're like, hey, this is what I need. I'll share this. I'm going to go on a tangent for just a moment. But I remember having this client and I just thought she was like such an amazing person. She was like so kind, so personable. She had a good career. But the thing I loved about her is I just thought she was such a truly, truly good person. Like in hard times, bad times, unfair situations, she just like led with her heart. And like, I thought it was such a beautiful thing. And so many of her personality needs were like, social connection, emotional connection. She had a really big need for like spiritual growth. And I think like comfort or security was in there. And so, she really cared about the relationships in her life and like her relationship to God. And that was like a big part of her self-identity. And I remember one day working with her and she had this big family and she was saying, I'm looking at all these other people in my life and like, they're so much more successful in their careers than I am. And they're doctors or lawyers or all these different things. And I was like, okay, well, let's sit with this for a second. Like, where in your personality needs is career growth or achievement or financial growth or wealth building, or like you're comparing yourself to people who have different need structures. Like we're all going to excel more often in what our personality needs are. And so she was able to be like, oh, I get it. Like I'm excelling in these areas that I actually care about because those are the things I'm showing up for. And me comparing myself to somebody who's focusing on different things and actually wants different things at a subconscious level doesn't actually make sense. Like it's just causing me to feel badly about myself and have lowered self-esteem. And I get it. Like, and it was this very like freeing moment for her to not compare. And you'll see more and more is when we get in touch with our needs and evaluate our own needs, we're less in that comparison mindset. We're deriving our sense of identity from the inside. And that boosts us as individuals. So anyways, back to the question. Sorry if that confused anybody. So do you find yourself excessively comparing yourself to others? Was that question, deriving your identity from the outside in? Do you have to feel needed in order to feel alive? This is like a big one for codependent individuals. They kind of feel like their sense of self like thrives when people really need them. And they can be that person who's great under pressure in hard situations, but sometimes may even like have a difficult time relating to people when they're not in this sort of like chaotic storm. And for those of you who were on the webinar a couple of weeks ago with like the savior complex dynamics and the drama triangle, there's the savior, right? Or the hero. It's like the person that's who they think they are, but then sometimes there's not a big ability to relate outside of that. And that very much goes hand in hand with codependency. Do you feel resentment towards other people in your life often because you are repressing your needs? Okay. So generally, a lot of resentment means a lot of unmet needs. And generally, there's a pretty strong correlation, not necessarily like direct cause, because there can be other things, but correlation with um, codependent behaviors and patterning and programming. And last but not least, are other people outside of you the biggest source of your identity? Okay, so try to check in with all of those. I'm going to read them from the top really quick. Do you say yes to others when you want to say no? Do you find yourself being triggered by other people setting a boundary with you? Do you get extremely upset or bothered when other people are upset with you to the point of having difficulty focusing? Do you crave approval or praise in order to derive your self-esteem from others? Do you lose yourself in relationships or get afraid of being swallowed whole? Do you suppress your emotions or pretend you're okay when you're not because you're afraid to have some kind of conflict in any form? Do you avoid speaking up about your needs or your boundaries in order to avoid conflict? So it's a boundary question. Do you believe that your mistakes equal failure in relationships and thus put excessive pressure on yourself? Do you blame other people to hide your mistakes because you can't take accountability and feel all of that shame or fear? Do you excessively compare yourself to others or derive your sense of identity from the outside in? Do you feel resentment to others because you're constantly repressing your needs, and are other people outside of you the biggest source of your identity? Okay, so try to notice 1 to 13. What's your score? What shows up for you? And also try to notice the ones that showed up for me. That's going to be what I'm plugging into the steps we're going to go through together to actually recondition some of these components. Okay, so where you're like, oh, I totally don't set boundaries. Okay, good. So when we talk about the boundaries part, that's going to be a really important thing to really hone in on. Okay, so a couple other things. There's a lot I want to share with you today. Fears that the codependent has of healing. Sometimes these are just little passive things to pay attention to. Sometimes codependents are afraid to heal because they're like, what if I become selfish? What if I become a bad person? What if it jeopardizes my relationships when I set boundaries? What if I become abandoned, right? So we'll discuss this part. But essentially, if you find yourself fearing setting boundaries, speaking up for your needs, you have to do some belief reprogramming first on those fears in order to then feel comfortable doing those things. And it's also really valuable to notice when you're first starting to break through codependent patterns that generally codependents have a history of training people in their life, conditioning people indirectly to think that they have no needs. So, sometimes it can be a little bit rocky to relationships if you've been a codependent for 40 years and now you're going to start setting boundaries with people in your life and your friendships and your romantic relationships. Like sometimes people can take that personally. And it's not because they should be, it's because sometimes when people change around us all of a sudden that we are really connected to, we can be afraid of losing that person on some deeper, more fundamental level. And so it can cause an eruption in some way, right? Oh no, why are you changing? What's going on? So that can also be addressed, right? Like by actually sharing with people in your life, hey, I'm going to be working on my boundaries. I'm going to be working on breaking codependent patterns that I'm realizing I have. I've been working on myself. I'm realizing these things and being able to share accordingly. Wow, I see some of the scores in here. You just each check, Brianna, you just every single one where you're like, oh, I have a number here, and number 1, that was me, you give yourself a point. You're kind of like tallying them like in a little tally. I hope that makes sense. 5+, it's low for me. That's because you've been working so much on yourself, Narosha. 7.5, 2 out of 13. Good for you. Resented people in the past because they weren't getting their need, because they were getting their needs met. I wasn't. Exactly. Wendy, 2 half scores that I'm currently working on. Love that. That's because you're in here, you guys are in here working hard on some of these things for some time. And obviously everybody's working on different situations and different points. 4.5, amazing. Hi, Natalie. Let's see here. Okay. So, 2.5 out of 13, amazing. And let's see, 4, fantastic. Okay, amazing job, you guys. So when you look at like what we actually want to do in here, next course to tackle, if that's a big focus of your experience right now. So try to look at like what you're afraid of when it comes to changing codependent patterns. And, so much of healing through these things are 7 key steps. And so I've sort of narrowed it down into like the 7, what I think most important things are. Step number 1, we basically just covered together, which is overcome denial and lack of conscious awareness. Okay. So must actually become aware of these different subconscious features. And this is what we're doing by really honing in, really making these things conscious, really paying a lot of attention. Now all of a sudden we're like, okay, I see my patterns. I see what's going on. I'm out of, and not that we go into denial, like intentionally, not like we're like, oh, but sometimes it's an unknown. We didn't have the opportunity to learn about some of these things in the past. Step number 2 is to look at the long-term cost of breaking this pattern. This can be a bit of a painful step, but you can take some time and actually sit down and write out like, okay, what are the costs? Like, how is this actually affecting me in a negative way? Because any behavior that we're consistently buying into, we have a lopsided perception with. So we think that there's more good than bad. And there may have been more good than bad to try to attach to your caregiver as a child, but sometimes as we become an adult in our adult lives, sometimes there's now more harm than good, even though our programming visually or from a program perspective in our mind's eye sees this as being more positive than negative, right? So we're trying to rebalance these perceptions. We have to actually look and be like, what has codependency truly cost me? And you can think of the times you said no, or you said yes to people when you meant no. The times that you experienced resentment and then how you reacted to that resentment. Did you close down? Did you push people away? Did you lash out? Did you express anger? The times that you maybe felt like you had to tell lies to avoid shame. I have a family member in my life who I love very much, who I have seen and shared with them over the years. Hey, like sometimes you shirk the truth because you're so afraid of just saying, hey, I made a mistake and it's okay. I would accept you anyways. And like, you can share with me but when I looked at their history and their patterning, they had a lot of codependent stuff going on. Decisions you made specifically to gain approval that may have led to self-abandonment, self-denial to people please, maybe not leaving unhappy situations. This can be a huge cost of codependency. How long did you stay in situations that weren't actually serving you? Because you were just so afraid of being alone or so afraid of like hurting somebody else, perhaps. And that can be a huge pain point of what's really pushing codependency. And just other dynamics to really look at, like all the times you might have been really indecisive because you were considering things from the outside in, taking on other people's feelings. A couple of you shared some great things in the chat earlier about how much you are just constantly living your life to try to gain approval or to try to not be abandoned, and how exhausting that is, right? So try to write out all the costs. What's happening when you write out all the costs is you're breaking down the stored emotional associations that are saying, oh, codependency is good. Okay. Because you might have learned that helped you survive as a little kid or early in adult life, but it's time to be able to actually look and to access new patterns of behavior and create freedom. Number 3, and by the way, a lot of these steps are coming from the codependency course. So you can go into the codependency course, you can print off a workbook, everything's laid out, all that kind of stuff as well. But it's always fun to do them live together and add some bonus content. So number 3 is to make a list of all the places that you need to make amends to yourself. Okay, so try to look at all these different situations where you did these things, because number 2, you're looking at the cost, and try to actually take a moment. It sounds kind of like almost cheesy in a way, but it's really powerful if you're willing to sit with it, like actually sit, like almost like in a meditation or in like a journaling, like self-reflection, and just like acknowledge what that felt like for you and get in relationship to seeing your side. Codependent people are seeing other people way more than they're seeing themselves. Okay. They're seeing how other people would feel in the situation, but not how they would feel. They're seeing what this person's feelings are, but not their own feelings. And so being able to actually sit down and be like, okay, I'm seeing other people more than I'm seeing myself. I'm going to sit and see myself, see the effects of this truly. And what you're doing in this step is sort of like getting back into relationship to yourself to a certain degree, right? You're actually like reconnecting to yourself at a deeper subconscious level. So make a list of all the places you need to apologize to yourself and see yourself. And then in a second column, you can write out, what do I need to change? Right? What needs to be different from this point forward? So let's say you're sitting with step number 2 and you're going, some of the big costs for me are that I stayed in a relationship for 2 years too long because I was afraid to leave and hurt that person's feelings. Okay. Which I hear from codependents all the time. And so with that being said, you might want to sit down and go, okay, what did that feel like for me? Well, for 2 years, every day I ignored what I needed, right? For 2 years, I put up with things I wasn't actually happy with. I allowed my needs to take a totally backseat in my life and take ownership for that, right? Until we see ourselves and the effect that something had on ourselves, it can be really difficult to actually be motivated to make a change, right? So we're going to pause at step 3 for a moment. And if you feel comfortable sharing in the chat an experience that you might have had where you did something codependent and how it actually affected you in the relationship to yourself. Okay, so was it a form of self-betrayal? Did you stay somewhere? I love that comment, Ben, getting comfortable with being disliked for whatever reasons, right? That's part of like the breaking of codependent patterns, is to be like, okay, sometimes not everybody's going to agree with me. Sometimes I'm going to be disliked for things, and that's okay. That's about people's projections onto you, right? That's like the root of it at the end of the day. Having enough care to myself to end relationships that are not working, beautiful. Being okay with saying no. Someone mad at me, felt like I had to fix it or be okay with it, instead of just letting them be mad. Yeah, right. And that constant like pressure eating away. Just any situation where I allowed my need for comfort to override my need for being seen and heard. That's so well said. I love that, because what you're doing is it's like, okay, let me prioritize comfort and not have conflict and just stay here and stay safe at the expense of not sharing my truth. Right. So you can see like the priorities you have there. And then you can look at the cost of those things, right, to spark you into wanting to change. Because when we shift our emotional associations at a subconscious level, that's actually what promotes changing our growth. I felt weak. I felt like a coward when I didn't stand up for myself. That's so vulnerable. And I love that. And then what happens is, at least in my experience, then what happens is then you hold on to that and it festers. And then guess what happens? 2 interactions later or 2 weeks later, you're showing somebody else that, look, I'm not a coward, right? And we're trying to equilibrate for that for some time. And that's what the mind does. So great share. I've worked tons on codependency in my human relationships, but I still live a codependent relationship with my rescue dog who has special needs. I prioritized her needs for 2.5 years now. I remember you saying this. And like, it would be really good to sit down, Gemini, and just write out like, hey, what would all my boundaries be so that I can bring more centeredness to the relationship, right? Where I can consider myself a little bit more. Of course, this dog has special needs and you can be considerate of that, but like, how can I allow myself to also be seen or get support or help in that situation as well? Stayed in an unhealthy relationship for too long, ended up being ill for 3 years. Thank you for sharing that. Sometimes things come out in our body, right? Because sometimes we are constantly in sympathetic nervous system mode and fight or flight, and we have excess cortisol reactions and norepinephrine reactions, which over time actually have a negative consequence to our immune system. So, sometimes when we stay and we're not happy and we're not okay, it can literally become something that affects us physically. So thank you for that vulnerable share. I think Brooke sharing with somebody else, ignored my own needs and boundaries for way too long, causing constant stress and probably illness as a result. Very next one. Wow. So you see these different dynamics, right? And some of the costs. So now what we do is you see some of these unfold is sit with it and share some kind of apology to yourself, right? If you see some of these dynamics, you can sit with it and go, I'm sorry, like I didn't see myself more, and have some compassion for where you were at and what you were going through. And also realize, like, as much as this is painful to see, I also can see like how these things affect me, which is going to be so much of what prompts us to not keep repeating. And try to notice like that was you with the amount of awareness you had at that time, due to the modeling and conditioning you had prior, doing the absolute best you could with what you understood at the time, right? So by evaluating the costs, we're not making ourselves wrong or bad. We're able to see, ouch, this hurts, so I don't want to keep repeating it. Okay. So our next step, once we have this like really powerful kind of recognition, it's sort of like when we go through the 12 steps, right? It's like, really being able to show up and take accountability and make amends and, some of these different dynamics that can be themes within that. Our next step is step 4. And I'm going to share a little bit of this step with you, and you can take some time later to like journal about this or think about this. But our next step is to understand what a vision of a truly healthy interdependent relationship looks like. I always think it's really difficult in life to try to get somewhere when we don't even know what that's supposed to look like, right? What that destination is. And generally, almost everybody who's codependent comes from codependent modeling, right? That's what they're taught. That's what they know. That's what they've been conditioned to see for so long. So then when somebody says, okay, stop being codependent, it's like, but what does that even look like? So some things to pay attention to, and what not being codependent looks like, and what healthy interdependency looks like, is at its roots, being able to have a strong sense of self and know who you are. We're going to talk about that more in the next step. To have healthy boundaries. We're going to talk about that as well. But to also, when you're making choices, in every choice that you say yes or no to be able to take yourself into consideration in that moment. And if we're too disconnected from our own feelings and needs, then we have to start with doing some feelings and needs work so we can get there in real time. So an example of this, and like some of you are probably sick of this example, but this is the one that always comes to mind. Sanjana is going to know which one it is. But let's say that I have a neighbor, and my neighbor says, hey, I need you to help me move. Like I'm moving. I need you to help me pack up. And let's say it's Saturday. Let's say it's today. And let's say they say, I need you to help me do it all day tomorrow. It's probably going to take 12 hours. And I can't start until 12 p.m. in the afternoon. So I need you from 12 p.m. till 12 a.m. A codependent person, if they really like their neighbor or really get along with their neighbor, might feel this pressure to like go and show up and do all that stuff. Like, oh, I have to be there. But somebody who's not codependent, who really likes their neighbor, so let's say if this were me right now, I might be like, ooh, they really need help. They really need support. I see that. That's a tough situation that they're in. I have an early meeting Monday morning, and I have responsibilities that I have to take care of around my house and my life on Sunday. And I can't go for 12 hours. There's no way. And so what can I do, right? What can I do that feels truthful for me, that doesn't feel self-violating, that doesn't feel sacrificing, but instead compromising? And a compromise is when we take ourselves into consideration in the process. A sacrifice is when we don't. So a compromise would look like me going, you know what? I really care about this person. I can stop by for 2 hours. And here's the time that I'm able to bring. And I say, okay, I'll be there from 12 until 2. Or if I have full commitments on Sunday, maybe I say, hey, I'm not available at all tomorrow. I'm really sorry, but you asked me at the last minute, and I'm going to drop you off some coffee on the way out to my commitments in the afternoon, or, something, right? But in the process, whatever my outcome is, will be obviously independent or dependent on whatever the situation is for me at the time. But I'm able to consider myself and see what I can actually give. And I cannot stress enough the importance of, when we give to other people, being able to consider ourselves in that process of giving. And here's why. Because then I can show up as a person in the world that gives from a place of abundance and truth, instead of gives from a place of what leads to long-term resentment, expectation, frustration, and all of that trajectory and outcome leads to like holding things over people's heads, being overly offended when they don't do something back. Like, we want to show up in our relationship so that when we give from truth. There's no, oh, now you owe me back. There's no monitoring. There's no scorekeeping in relationships. And the immunity for that, the remedy for that, is to consider yourself when making choices. And I know for me as a person, I definitely grew up codependent. I definitely was very codependent as a young adult, my late teens, first couple of years of my 20s. And I would totally scorekeep. I would be like, I did this, this, and this. And then you didn't call me back on time, like after all the things that I did. And it's like, that's really painful. That's painful for me. And that's painful for that person. Cause then that person thinks, oh, I can't make mistakes. I have to be perfect. I have to walk on eggshells. And so instead, one thing I was very lucky to learn at a fairly young age is how to give in a way that was like, hey, is this my truth? Like, so when I give and I never think about it again, or I feel really good about giving and it's so aligned and it's so truthful. And then if somebody doesn't give me something back a year later, or doesn't do something or makes a mistake, I'm like, oh, they're a human in the relationship. And if I need something from them, I go and I talk about it. I say, hey, I actually really need support right now. Can you support me in some way? Right. But it's not because 4 years ago, X, Y, and Z. And that's the difference between healthy relating and unhealthy patterns, right? And so, we really want to be able to get out of that dynamic, right? Out of the scorekeeping, out of the giving from lack or expectation back, because then we get into covert contracts, right? Like, oh, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to expect that you'll do this thing later on. And that hurts. It hurts everybody in the relationship, including ourselves. So really being able to, when we're talking about what looks like a healthy relationship, that's a big part of it. And healthy interdependency means that. It means I know how to meet my own needs. I know what my needs are. And then also, because I'm very emotionally literate about my own needs, I know how to express them to you. I know how to share those things with you. And if you can't meet them, that's okay, because I can meet them too. Or because I'm good at communicating, I can go communicate them to other people. And I don't put up with somebody never meeting my needs and not having a healthy overall exchange in a relationship where we're both showing up and participating. But I have room because I'm very equipped to have my buckets of needs very full. I am okay with when you have times in your life where you can't show up as well. And I'm accepting of that. I'm not angry at it, because you're not the only source of being able to meet my needs, right? So the more we're abundant in that way, now we enter into healthy interdependence, right? So let's say you have a partner or somebody you're dating or somebody you really care about, and they're going through a hard time and you're going through a hard time at the same time. And that person's not really showing up the way you need them to, but you can see it's because they're going through a hard time. If you know how to support yourself in a hard time and you know how to be able to communicate to others, you're still going to have your buckets full 70, 80% of the way. And then when that hard time passes, we don't have all this resentment and anger. And also we know how to communicate and negotiate about our needs. So those are some really important things to keep in mind. And when we're looking at like healthy interdependent modeling, there's open communication, there's compromises instead of sacrifices, there's knowing our needs and being able to meet them ourselves, there's having healthy boundaries and accepting when other people have to have boundaries with you too, and not personalizing it, right? So some things to keep in mind, but take some time if you've historically been very codependent and write out like, what do you think a healthy relationship should look like? Like, what would be ideal for you? And how do you share? How do you communicate? How do you show up with other people? And it'll be a very valuable exercise to go through. Step 5 is strengthening self-identity. So we have a whole course on this in a lot of detail. If you've been historically codependent, I highly recommend actually taking the course like in full. But what that course asks you to do is really evaluate, and these are some exercises you can do, but really evaluate what you want in all 7 areas of life, and to check in with your habits of showing up for yourself. So, codependents, when we look at career, codependents are often struggling in their career, whether it's like the achievement basis of their career on a more superficial level, but oftentimes codependents are struggling to actually enjoy their career. Because if you've spent your whole life being so focused on everybody else, have you even thought about what you really want? Or did you kind of fall into something because that's what you should be doing according to people's opinions outside of you? Or that's what society thinks you should be doing, or that's what, so sometimes codependents really struggle in that area. And that's a really powerful exercise to go back into and be like, what do I really want for myself? And even if it takes 2 or 5 years to get there, is it important for me enough to be able to carve out some space to move in that direction? Financially, codependents sometimes struggle. Codependents, I would know somebody was codependent in my practice when they would come in on their first day, and we would talk about their patterns with dating. And this was only one of many different manifestations of this, but I would see people sometimes be like, as soon as I get into a relationship or as soon as I start dating and I really like somebody, I spend all my money. Like I go out on fancy dates, I try to travel it, and I just, for whatever reason, bleed into my savings. And it's like, yeah, because you're prioritizing like the approval from the person so much more than you're prioritizing like healthy balance across the 7 areas of life. So a relationship comes in, and other parts of the self, the career part of yourself, financial element of your life, that goes out the window again, right? It's everything is just about this. It's almost this like addictive kind of focus in a way. So you can see these different dynamics that may unfold. And so, being clear about what are your boundaries in the 7 areas of life, like what are your needs, and how can you prevent yourself from getting into a relationship where you get into that relationship and then the other areas of your life become obsolete. So part of strengthening self-identity is knowing what your needs are in the 7 areas of life: career, financial, mental, your thoughts, opinions, ideas, beliefs, learning, emotional, emotions, personal growth, emotional regulation, career, financial, mental, emotional, spiritual. And spiritual, if you don't have any spiritual beliefs, totally fine. That can be like your morals, your values, right? In that area of life. If you don't believe in anything other than yourself, that's still very much that area of life. And then physical, your health habits, your self-care, your physical self-care, how much you sleep, is your diet in alignment with what your body needs? Have you taken time to ever consider that? And then relationships. Do you get into a romantic relationship and your friends and family no longer matter for the first 6 months, right? Unless you're calling them to vent about the relationship you're in, right? So being mindful about those elements that can take place, and having that self-identity by actually exploring those areas of your life. That's so much of strengthening your sense of self. And then also knowing what your needs are from relationships and to feel fulfilled in life. And obviously we cover that so much in PDS, like needs. The needs course is a great resource for that. And a lot of the courses, for anybody who's new, they're like an hour and a half long, 2 hours, and they'll really help. Like they're supposed to be sort of chunked down so that you can get through it in a week or less and really go through and like get the information you need for the next steps. So learning our needs, being able to meet our needs, and having goals and a vision for what we want and who we are and what fulfills us across 7 areas of life. And then our next step is those boundaries. So those boundaries to uphold those things. So, for example, sometimes I would see people who would be in a romantic dating situation where they start off dating and they would like call out of work more often, stop paying attention to their career goals. Like I said, spend a bunch of their money all of a sudden because they wanted the fancy things to get the person's approval, or, and so sometimes it would be, okay, well, when you're dating and you have this tendency to move in that direction, what are your boundaries instead? Like what boundaries do you need to have so that, or if you think you're going to spend every evening with somebody, like no time boundary, I'm going to see them 6 days a week, 7 days a week, 5 days a week. Hey, like you may see that in your patterns and in your history, but can you see how that would actually prevent you from like taking time to get to know the person, taking time to know if that person's really a good fit for you, and especially taking time to actually caretake for the other areas of your life a little bit? And so being able to have healthy boundaries ahead of time when dating, like how often you'll see somebody, how much you'll speak to them, how much time you'll still allocate consciously and intentionally for other areas of life, other goals in the other areas of life, for other friendships, for family relationships. So you don't on autopilot start dating somebody and all those areas of your life are ignored for the next 6 or 8 months, right? So really being mindful about that is extremely valuable, and having those boundaries out ahead of time. And just defining what your boundaries are in relationships, right? Like what mental boundaries do I want to have? Do I want to be somebody who, when I start dating, I just agree with that, whatever their religious and political beliefs are? Or do I take the time to explore my own and be okay with having a difference of opinion from people sometimes? Be okay with saying, hey, I really value that opinion. That's very intelligent, or I can see where you're coming from, but I actually think X, Y, and Z completely on the other end of the continuum, and that's okay. And going back to what Ben was saying, right? Like being okay with people disliking that sometimes, right? Being okay with other people having different feelings about things. And then knowing your physical boundaries, obviously, but your emotional boundaries are huge. Like noticing what emotions you take on and then reprogramming, using auto suggestion to reprogram your ideas, right? Like this idea that I'm responsible for how other people feel. Why is that not true? What is proof of the opposite? And the more proof of the opposite you give, the more you engage the subconscious mind in the process, which obviously is a huge part of reprogramming. And again, if anybody's new, you'll see in the emotional mastery course, all the tools for reprogramming your subconscious mind, all the big ones. So that will really help to be able to recondition some of these concepts or ideas. And boundaries and knowing your boundaries, like where you end and where somebody else begins, is arguably like one of the most important parts of ending codependency in relationships as a whole. And then last but not least, when you do a deep dive into, these components of your life, right? You look at all the codependent patterns that are there, being able to actually communicate these things to others, right? It's nice to have this all audited. It's nice to know what your boundaries are ahead of time. It's nice to be able to reprogram some of the core wounds and to know your needs, but you have to then take that out into the world and communicate them. So if you have a need in relationships for certainty, share that with somebody. Hey, certainty is important to me. Like, let's pick a routine. Let's have like a weekly date that we go on. Or if you have a need to feel understood and something's happening in a situation you don't feel understood, you can pause the conversation and say, hey, it's really important to me that you understand just where I'm coming from. Even if you disagree, I just want you to see like what my perception was in the situation. And here's what it is. Does that make sense to you? Right. So like being able to actually take this information, share our needs with others, share our boundaries with others. And one of the most beautiful parts about doing this is that by sharing your needs and your boundaries, you share your truth. And you actually allow other people to truly see and know you as the real you, as the you that you've discovered and taken the time for. And that's how we actually feel truly loved. And I found so many times with people over the years that, especially like, let's look at an anxious, preoccupied person, for example. I found so many times over the years that like anxious, preoccupied people would constantly feel like unseen, unloved, like they didn't matter, like they were unimportant. All these really sad things. But so much of it when we would explore together was because they didn't know who they were and what they needed. They hadn't taken time for that. So that gets missed by everybody else, right? People can't mind read into like the inner depths of who you are when you haven't figured that out yet. And so when you don't share yourself, you don't empower yourself to feel seen and known. And you don't empower yourself to feel respected and more unconditionally loved and deeply accepted. And so we just get into this emptiness of like trying to people please and then gain some kind of connection. But then when things get real, it feels very short-lived, right? When we have a real need, it feels really painful. Or then we communicate from a place of criticism because we're going, you never do this, instead of, hey, I really need this. And that doesn't really help us get our needs met long-term anyways. So really being able, as sort of one of the last big steps here, to show up, to communicate, to share ourselves that we've discovered with other people helps us feel more deeply connected. So this is some of the big stuff about codependency today. For the theme, we've got some extra time, so I'm going to dive right into some live questions. So Sophia, if you want to go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, hi. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk. Thank you. I'm just getting a note up on my device actually. So I guess my question is kind of links really nicely into this codependency thing, because it's a lot about I think having prioritized a lot of people in my life previously, I'm sort of like working out a way forward to kind of like develop what I want and meet my needs and so on. But I think I've come up, especially lately, feeling a bit flat with it. I think I've had a string of, and actually going back to it happened in a big way when I was very young. But just like really trying very hard at something and then it just not working out. And I've had a string of some of those lately, and it's kind of unfortunate. I did the I can't remember the name of the course now, but the course where you sort of like set lots of goals and things, and I set 2 sort of things and neither worked out despite despite my trying really hard. But anyway, so I'm just finding it a bit hard to kind of like and I did sort of all the reprogramming about why it can work out and stuff, and then it still didn't. And then I've got so I've got that kind of thing going on, and then I've got something that I'm sort of stopping myself. So like if I think, oh, you know, I could go for that job or whatever, but then I always think of the downsides and then I don't go for it. So it's like, yeah, it's just like how to get unstuck from that kind of like funk, really. That's my question.
Can I ask a clarifier for a moment?
Yeah.
What was the time period between when you set the goal and then finish some of the reprogramming work on like the fears of trying to go after the goal and then decided that the goal didn't work? What was that time period?
Different in both cases, actually. Yeah, quite different. One being like a matter of weeks, and then one being a matter of months.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So the first thing that stood out to me about your question is your expectation. So look at this. Like, this sounds cheesy, but it's true. Like when we fail, it's because we gave up, right? Like we don't fail, like it's not over, right? So what I would say, and what I have seen over and over and over and over again, without exception, with like truly successful people, and I was blessed to work with like a lot of my clients for a long period of time were like CEOs of companies and, you know, very successful people. And what happens is, when we don't realize that we have to pivot or there's more to learn, and then we decide that we're a failure, that's when failure actually happens. But when so when you say weeks or months, like I've tried a lot of things for weeks and months and they didn't work out. And then, but you take the lessons, you take the learning, you go, okay, like this was going on over here and it didn't work out because of this. I'm going to try this next time around, or I'm going to pivot this way with this next situation, or I'm going to, and the more we take, like, so you did the things right in steps. You set goals, you got intentional, you reprogrammed your fears of them not working out. So you actually gave yourself room to then go after them because you didn't believe, I'm just going to fail, so why bother, or I'm not good enough to go there, or things like that. It sounds like, so those first 2 steps, nailed it, amazing. But then when it doesn't work out the first time, it doesn't mean it's a failure yet. It just means that you're still in the journey. And so what I would really urge you to do and encourage you to do is to be like, okay, so why didn't it work out so far? What learnings can I take away from that? And how can I take those learnings back into my next go round of refining this process of achieving that goal? And I would say for a lot of people, obviously, depending on the situation, sometimes it takes a few years to get a big goal that's really important to us. Sometimes certain paths are shorter, but if you look at it as like each step of the way, when it doesn't work, it's a learning process. That's where like the real growth happens. And that's where you get closer and closer and closer to the outcome you're looking for. And as a byproduct of living that way, you also gather like so much more like information and knowledge and awareness and growth and learning inside of you that prepare you for the next steps around. So I would say, like, I would actually urge you to question your expectations, do a little dump on paper. What was I expecting about like how fast I'll achieve the goal, or that I shouldn't have any mistakes along the way, or my shoulds about how quickly it should work out? And I would question some of those things. And then I would be like, and what can I learn from this go around? And then if I still feel afraid of trying again, what fears can I do work on so I can take the next steps? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I just feel really sad when I hear you say that, because I don't really feel like there is a way forward. Because yeah.
And what's
Yeah.
the belief? Because you might have put it in a box. So you might have gone like, do you feel comfortable sharing about the more specific situation?
Yeah, so I mean, there've been various, but the latest 2 was I was trying to get I was sort of, because I'm feeling really upset actually. I didn't realize I was this upset about it. But like one of them was like I was putting together these online courses about writing, And basically like I put them online. I put loads and loads of time into teaching myself how to do it and stuff, and it's just basically made hardly any money. And the platform that I was using changed their rules, and I don't really think that I have any more ideas anyway.
Yeah.
um
So like this is such a good example of this. So and like I see you, like I see why that would like hurt and feel defeating and scary, and like I tried so hard, I did all the work, but like it may be, and I see this all the time with people starting businesses, is it may be that, you know, I think we think a lot of the time like, oh, if I have a really good course or a really good idea, it's just going to unfold, right? And the idea is half of it. It's like literally half. It's like, how good is your idea? How good is your product? And then the other 50%, sometimes at least, is then how do you get that idea out in front of people? And so it sounds like you've done a great job of like researching how to write the course and how to do the online course about marketing. But then did you build funnels around it? Did you set up systems? Did you, do you have like digital marketing stuff going on? Do you have all of these steps? And if not, you did not fail yet, like nowhere near. If you came up with a really good product, you're just only a very couple steps along the journey. And so like I would really encourage you from my heart, like don't give up. This is a great example of like, hey, it's not over. It's only been a few weeks or a few months. You're just like in the infancy of the experience. And so I would say sit down, make a list of all the different things that you might not have done yet about getting your product in front of people, and maybe spend some time, just like you research so much about the course part and how to build the course, research, okay, how do I actually drive traffic towards my course? Because you can make all the courses in the world, but if nobody sees them, it doesn't mean they're not good enough. It means that you just didn't get people, that you didn't get them in front of people yet. So I don't think that's a failure. I mean, obviously I don't know the whole story, but I just think I just think you're only one step in, and you haven't seen all the other steps that still have to come yet. And it's a beautiful growth opportunity.
mm. Yeah, that's possible. And then yeah, no, I still feel like I just don't have any more ideas or whatever. I don't know, just like I don't know enough about it. And
Yeah, it's
yeah,
because you're in learned helplessness around it. So it's because like
yeah,
you haven't been able to take those next steps. So like what I would do in actual steps to get out of learned helplessness is I would
yeah,
sit down and I would do some research. I would start by just watching some YouTube videos, just getting familiar with like the concepts and the ideas, but you'll really need
yeah,
to know a lot about, and you may not need to do this yourself. You might be able to like partner with somebody or hire them, or there's internship programs in different areas, but you can do, look at digital marketing, look at how to build a funnel, just research these things on YouTube and or online, Google them. And then you have to write in the mindset mastery and life mapping course, there's a part in that course that's, you can just print off the workbook, and it's like, what are your steps, and then what are your steps and strategies, and then how can you time box them? And it really helps you take like what's unknown and this big scary thing and really like fine tune it so it's simplified. And what I would do is I would go through digital marketing steps and strategies, um,
mm,
and and then what I would do is I would put out all those different things. So I may have to learn about digital marketing. Maybe I have to read 2 books about it. Then I have to come up with my own way of building a funnel. Then I have to drive some traffic to that funnel. I may hire a digital marketer or partner with them so that they just take a percentage of profit share and I don't have to put all that money up front. And generally that's how a lot of digital marketers work anyways, but you'll have to put those steps together as you go and you'll refine the
yeah,
steps. But you are nowhere
mm.
near failure. You just haven't, you just got caught at one of the steps. Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Yeah,
Yeah. And if you
yeah,
have a history of feeling like you tried and something failed, that wound sometimes, if that was like in your past or in childhood, that wound will come up sometimes. And we just think that's the end because we assume that wound because it's familiar. So we assume, okay, so then this is just it. It's happening again. When really that may not be the case of like objective reality, but instead our interpretation. And then if that interpretation keeps blocking us, then we keep repeating this over and over again, right? And then we keep stopping because we assume, oh, I'm a failure at this now. And then we don't start again. And that's when it is a failure because we actually stopped proceeding.
yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so anyways, I know a lot of people have questions or their hands raised, but we'll do the live Q&A in just a moment in the next one, and I'll jump into all the questions. But Sophia, to just summarize, I would say, just research about digital marketing and just research about like online funnels. And
Yeah.
then get familiar there. And then from that, you can print off that part of the workbook and the mastery course. It's the big chart at the back, and it'll say steps and strategies. Try to fill that out. The more you do more research, like just spend like 10 hours researching it. The more you do more research, you're going to see the next steps, the next strategies, what has to happen. And then you'll be able to be like, okay, I have to hire a digital marketer or build somebody out with a profit share, or you'll be able to take those steps forward that will help propel this beautiful product it sounds like you've created. It sounds like an amazing idea, like courses about writing. Super cool. And the digital world's like exploding over the next like few years. And then you'll be able to actually get that in front of people, and then you'll see like where you're really at, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so I am going to jump on the next slide.